Okay, I'm back. Let's see if everybody else can find this one. Can you guys hear me okay? Does it sound better? I was able to switch the audio back to, for some reason, it crashed. And then when I reloaded it, it switched the audio from my Rodecaster, which does audio, to my camera, which is a camera. And sounds terrible because it's a camera. It's not meant to, oh well. All right. But anyway, Zach, I am sorry to have a really all over the place, choppy, cut up answer. But the short version is Christ on the cross wins for us more than was strictly required. And we can entreat the mercy of God by leaning on that. But similarly, people who are saints go above and beyond what is strictly required for salvation, right? Like, think about, hopefully it's clear, this idea of supererogatory goods should be very clear. Oh, somebody asked in the comments, is this a call-in show replying to YouTube comments? I hope that's an answer to your question. We're doing super chats, so if you've got a question, just super chat it, and then Vanessa's going to put it in. You can call, but nobody's going to answer you. So I don't know what you would call. So yes, supererogatory, like above and beyond, as being pretty key to both Christ's life, but also the life of the saints, should be an easy thing to understand. And then the fact that this might make God more inclined to grant us something we ask should also be clear as well. Tomas Nolasco says, if true, what Charlie Kirk's Catholic funeral means. I don't know if he was buried, if he had a Catholic funeral or not. Can someone claimed he did? I have not seen any proof of that. So I don't know. I mean, she might be right, but I don't know if that is true or not. It's interesting. Like, there was the public kind of memorial service. Whatever funeral details happened seemed to have been pretty tightly kept. Oh yeah, somebody else asked if I don't get to super chats. There are more super chats that I'm going to get to today. You can just know that right now. Like, if you, there's way more that I'm going to get to today. I get to them as soon as I can. I don't know. Oh, I see where it says current stream. I'm not even there yet. I have this problem. Look, I want to give all of you long-winded, complicated, nuanced answers, but I also want to answer all of your questions. I don't know how to do both of those. Matt says, what is the best way to explain sacred tradition to evangelical relatives who appreciate much of what the Catholic Church teaches, but also believe it is added over time many unbiblical teachings? So I'd say two things. One, the word unbiblical sometimes means anti-biblical and sometimes just means not in the Bible. But a lot of good things aren't in the Bible, like which books are in the Bible is never taught in the Bible. So everyone necessarily believes in things that aren't in the Bible. Because if you don't, you can't believe in the Bible in the first place. Because the word Bible is not in the Bible, the contents of the Bible aren't in the Bible in terms of like being taught explicitly. These books and only these books are sacred scripture. No book does that. So our belief in 73 or 66 books or whatever, however many books you believe in, that belief is not coming from the Bible. That is a belief about the Bible. So I would stress that, first of all. Second, depending on what kind of evangelicals they are, every evangelical believes in all sorts of like man-made traditions. They don't even know are man-made traditions. Like, they have all sorts of just beliefs that they've received that if you said, where in the Bible does it say that, they couldn't possibly give an answer. So even when you've got people who's like, their church has taught them, the Catholic Church added a bunch of stuff in like the 4th century with Constantine, not only is that claim not true, that claim's not in the Bible. That is a claim about history they got from their pastor in their church or whatever. I'm not saying your particular relatives, but frequently. And these are just like church history claims that by their very nature couldn't have come from the Bible unless it was like a prediction. Like, I mean, obviously Christ could have said, in 300 years, there's going to be this guy named Constantine, and watch out for him, or he's equal to the apostles, or something in between. He doesn't say anything like that. So whatever your belief is about Constantine, good, bad, or other, that's an unbiblical belief if you just mean not in the Bible. So recognizing that there is no way to only believe things taught in the Bible, and that no Christian has ever done that, and no Christian should be expected to do that, and that belief. So okay, and then you take that and then you pair it with 2 Thessalonians 2:15, in which St. Paul says, "So then, brethren, stand hold and firm to the traditions which you were taught by us, either by word of mouth or by letter." He's just said, number one, you got to hold to tradition. So that automatically, in the word there's paradosis, the same word when Jesus condemns the Pharisees from traditions of men, paradosis is a Greek word in both cases. So tradition is good as long as it's tradition coming from the apostles or coming from God. It's not good if it's like a man-made tradition that then gets in the way. No, notice Jesus never just says traditions of men are bad. Plenty of traditions of men are good. We just celebrated Thanksgiving. This is a Puritan tradition of men. Undeniably, this is a religious observance created by people who are upset about religious observances, and it's a man-made Puritan post-apostolic tradition that does not claim to be an apostolic tradition. Couldn't possibly, right? We can trace the first Thanksgiving. It's clearly a man-made tradition. That's fine. We're good with it as long as it doesn't get in the way of honoring God. And a tradition like Thanksgiving is a perfectly good man-made tradition. It's one that honors God. So we're fine with it. Now, if this somehow got in the way, like if there was some divine duty you had to do and it conflicted with, Thanksgiving, you would have to be like, well, I have to serve God rather than this man-made tradition. But the man-made tradition is to honor God, so it's unlikely they're going to conflict. So when Jesus called out the Pharisees for their traditions, he's not just saying tradition is bad. That's a completely biblically illiterate misreading. And I think one of the reasons it's a biblically illiterate misreading is because things like the NIV translate paradosis in this really misleading way. So when paradosis is used in a positive sense, like in 2 Thessalonians 2, it's translated as teaching. It doesn't mean teaching. It's a thing handed on. It's a tradition. It literally, paradosis, thing handed on. When paradosis is used in a negative way, they translate it as tradition. So someone reading the NIV would come away believing that Jesus and Paul believe that tradition is bad and teachings are good. But rather, no, tradition is good or bad, depending on what kind of tradition it is. Saying a thing is handed on doesn't tell me whether it's a good or bad thing handed on unless I know who handed it on and what it is. So, tradition from the apostles is something we should hold to. The traditions which you were taught by us, so apostolic tradition, is good. We are to stand firm and hold to it. That's first thing. Second thing, it comes in two forms, word of mouth and letter. Letter, clear enough, New Testament. Also, word of mouth. This is oral tradition. Now, you can have people who say, well, these two things are the exact same. Nothing in the Bible says that. That is your own man-made tradition. That's right or wrong, but it's not biblical. So again, like you can have a non-biblical belief that these are the same things and you shouldn't have non-biblical beliefs, but that's obviously self-refuting because the only reason to accept this is your non-biblical belief that they're the same thing. According to Paul, we have to hold to both of them, which would be redundant advice if they're identical. Now, they're obviously overlapping, but if they're completely identical, why have two of them? In the same way that if Matthew, Mark, and Luke were just literally the same word for word gospel, you wouldn't have all three. They're telling the same story. They're overlapping. In one sense, they're the same, but in another sense, they're obviously different enough that you have all three of them. Well, similarly, you have word of mouth and letter. You wouldn't specify both of them if they were just completely identical. So the opposition to tradition is itself contrary to scripture and is worth pointing out. Now, in terms of adding things over time, you can ask them what kind of things they have in mind. This is often a very messy, kind of murky debate. It's probably better just to tap it at the source and say that whole framework that anything you don't see in the Bible isn't true is a bad framework. It is an unbiblical framework. It's a completely unworkable framework. No one in the Bible shows that they have the entire New Testament. So the mere fact we have a New Testament is in some way a development over time. We have the individual books, but having all of the New and Old Testament together as a book, the Bible, is certainly post-apostolic. And we would say it's guided by the Holy Spirit. Similarly, you can press them on things like the Trinity. Do you find the Trinity laid out in that way in the Bible? You don't. All of the seeds there are present, but then it takes a while for them to kind of be brought together and laid out in a systematic way. Either the Holy Spirit is guiding that process or he isn't. If he is, we don't have to worry about, things that become clearer over time. If he isn't, then we're in much deeper trouble, because how do we know we have the right books? How do we know we're right about the Trinity, et cetera, et cetera? All right. Rose says, forgeries in the church, donation of Constantine. Question mark. Book recommendations: Defending RC Against Calvinism and Defending Sacred Art / Prayer to Saints. Yes. The Saints Pray for You by Carlo Broussard would probably be good. He just released that last year. The subtitle is How the Christians in Heaven Help Us Here on Earth, just explaining, basically this role of the body of Christ. So if you want more of like the foundation for why we do this, I've had a few episodes of the show where I've unpacked some of these things as well. With the donation of Constantine, the donation of Constantine is a forgery. This is a problem. Like throughout history, there are plenty of times where the church is kind of duped by forgeries, and we don't know who who forged it. It was actually an Italian priest who debunked it as a forgery. Like he exposed the forgery in the 15th century. So it isn't like something where, this was something where I think the church had erroneously relied on this forged document as proof. If you've ever been in an argument where you point to a source and then your friend is like, actually that source is debunked, that thing you thought helped you was actually like an AI forgery, or Snopes has debunked that article, or whatever else. And you can have that kind of embarrassing moment of thinking that one of the arguments you've marshaled is good when it turns out not to be. That's very much the situation the church found itself in the Renaissance, where it realized that some of the documents that it relied on, we now had more sophisticated techniques and maybe a more skeptical class of scholars, including clergy. And they were saying, well, I don't think this is real. And sort of realized that some of these things were wrong. It's very hard not to have that happen, because you will have things where you have like an ancient text and you might have a few different versions of it. And then you might quote from a line and it turns out in like two of the other translations that line doesn't appear. And then it's like, well, was that part of the original or not? It gets really messy. So that's certainly embarrassing for the church. I don't think it is something that disproves Catholicism. The Catholic Church doesn't claim any special authority to be able to divine which documents are real and fake in terms of, random ancient documents. The donation of Constantine was about entrusting like the land of the Papal States. So there's not a major theological claim that I see as wrapped up in that. But it is nevertheless embarrassing for the church that even in terms of its secular authority, some of its claim is wrong. So, well, the Wikipedia says, and this again, speaking of things that could be wrong, I pulled up the Wikipedia for donation of Constantine, and it has a line that says, Pope Pius II wrote a tract in 1453, 5 years before becoming Pope, to show that the donation was though the donation was a forgery, the papacy owed its lands to Charlemagne and its power of the keys to Peter. However, he did not publish it. But notice these were two very distinct authority claims. So one claim was that the papacy has this secular authority in the middle part of Italy because land had been bequeathed to the Catholic Church. That is an oversimplification of history. There are some lands that are given to the Catholic Church, but the reality is the Roman Empire just sort of wasn't interested in protecting the western part. It sort of strategically retreated and left the west to the barbarians, and the papal states and everything arose in a vacuum of authority because someone needed to take care of the church, and the people as well. You have nuns and homeless and disease and everything else, and you have raiding barbarians doing horrible things. So the church had to defend the downtrodden, and there was no functioning government, so the church became that government. That's the actual history. That's the thing that the donation of Constantine is getting wrong. But none of that involves like the power of the keys or the authority of the papacy. That's a completely distinct authority. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Von Cobra says, did the Council of Florence declare First Esdras canon? No, it did not. But let me explain why after I pull this up. I've heard the argument that Florence and Trent don't agree, so the canon, at least between those dates, is not infallible, and any break in infallibility breaks forever. No, the issue has to do with the way that Esdras is mentioned. So in Council of Florence, it says Esdras and refers to Ezra. So you'll notice there's not Ezra. Ezra and Esdras are the same name. The problem is there are 4 different books that are known as Esdras. This is very confusing. So these are, and it's going to get worse. Don't worry. It's going to get more confusing the more I explain it. 4 books are First Esdras. This is the book most people have in the Bible as Ezra. Second Esdras. This is the book of Nehemiah. Third Esdras. This is not canonical and confusingly was renamed First Esdras. Fourth Esdras, confusingly renamed Second Esdras. So when you find older sources referring to First and Second Esdras, or the 2 books of Esdras, this refers to Ezra and Nehemiah. When they refer to the 3rd and 4th book of Esdras, those refer to the non-canonical books. Those are found in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, but not elsewhere. Later, I think Protestant scholars renamed it as Second Esdras, but this was just a horrible decision. It's a horrible decision because it is so confusing when Second Esdras could mean 2 different books. Like, what is even the point of having names and numbers at that point? Sultan Light 1027 says, any plans for vids on ministries to help parishes, like how to foster stewardship and missionary discipleship within our communities? I have done a little behind the scenes work on a thing to help with a stewardship letter that a bishop was asking for. I don't know if he's going to do anything with it. But in terms of like parish videos, I don't have any immediate plans for that. I'm not totally opposed to it. I don't have any good ideas offhand. I mean, I would actually love to do more on like a theology of stewardship, because I think the idea of stewarding not only your natural, but your supernatural gifts, and stewarding creation and stewarding your body are really important themes. But I mean, a lot of times people want stewardship so people like open up their wallets, which is good. I just want to do like a much deeper one on just recognizing the givenness of everything and then living accordingly. Lance says, can you explain why James White is wrong on the blessed man and imputed righteousness versus in Romans? I probably cannot do justice to his opinion offhand. The debate on imparted versus imputed righteousness, I think a few things can be said. I'm going to just say them generally. I don't want to say James White says XYZ because I don't remember the ins and outs of his opinion well enough to be able to speak for it. The passage in question was Romans 4. So also David pronounces a blessing upon the man to whom God reckons righteousness apart from works. Quote, blessed are those whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not reckon his sin. And so he takes that, and I think not unreasonably, if that's all you have, takes that not unreasonably to say he doesn't impute sin to him. Now, I think if you actually read the Old Testament, you see that those passages don't mean that. So, for instance, this is Psalm 32, I believe. Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord imputes no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. When I declared not my sin, my body wasted away, through my groaning all day long. For day and night thy hand was heavy upon me, my strength was dried up by the heat of the summer. I acknowledged my sin to thee, and I did not hide my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, then that is forgive the guilt of my sin. Therefore, let everyone who is godly offer prayer to thee. At the time of distress, in the rush of great waters, they shall not reach him. So there's an actual conversion and a forgiveness of sin there. And so the imputing of iniquity there is not saying um, God is not going to count my sin against me because Jesus died on the cross for me. This is the Old Testament. This is Psalm 32. That's very clearly not what David is saying. Rather, the Lord is no longer holding this sin against him because he asked for forgiveness and received it. Then we would both agree that a sinner, to be forgiven, needs to ask for forgiveness and receive it. That doesn't answer the question of imputation versus infused righteousness. It begs the question. Like he's assuming, well, because imputed righteousness exists, therefore the man who asks for forgiveness and receives it is because he's imputing the righteousness of Christ. I don't think that is a very good understanding of Psalm 32, particularly before the time of Christ. The other thing, Romans 4 is talking about Abraham and the way he is justified. But if you go back and look, so the line in question is Genesis 15:6. God promises Abraham the covenant, and Abraham believed the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. Genesis 15:6. But you'll notice all of that happens long after the call of Abraham in Genesis 12. So if you read Romans 4 to mean that Abraham has done nothing yet, you are incorrect. Abraham has followed God faithfully for several chapters now. And so the kind of classic Protestant read of Abraham's done nothing and this is discredited him as righteousness despite him not having done anything. You can literally just read Genesis and see that that's not true. There's more that could be said. The deeper issue is that if God merely imputes righteousness to us, then we're not actually made holy. He needs to actually make, in other words, you can put a towel over the stain on the floor and just be like, look, the floor is clean, and just cover up all the dirt and the dust. But if you're actually going to clean it, then you're not just going to do that. You're actually going to have to get into the grime and purify it. Very clear from Scripture, number one, that we are meant to be purified. I just talked about purification recently, but if you want a good passage on this, 2 Corinthians 7, verse 1, since we have these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of body and spirit and make holiness perfect in the fear of God. That our call is to actually be holy, actually be pure, not simply reckoned that when we're not, because God is not a liar, but actually not just declared holy, but made holy, so we can stand before God in heaven. That's the call. We can't do that on our own, and so the Lord gives us the Holy Spirit. So I don't know exactly where James White and I would part on all of that, but I think it's important to stress, like, imputational righteousness is, number one, a theological novum, as Alistair McGrath famously says in Justitia Dei. And number two, it's such a sad replacement for the biblical message. Because if you spend all eternity not actually holy, with God just declaring you holy, that stinks. The reality is God doesn't just declare you holy, he makes you holy. He makes it. So 1 John 3, let me just end the point with this. See what love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God. And so we are. The reason why the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Beloved, we are God's children now. It does not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And everyone who thus hopes in him purifies himself as he is pure. That's the claim. So there you go. It's something much more beautiful than just not being pure and being declared pure falsely by God. Two more questions, then I'm going to put off everything else until I'll do a few more questions, actually. I'll do at least three. I'm looking ahead. Joshua Devaney says, John 5:39, Protestants who reject Christ's presence. Okay. You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness to me. And then the line goes on, yet you refuse to come to me that you may have life. So I assume you mean something like in the Eucharist. Is that right? I don't know. But I think one thing that should be clear is Jesus in John 5 is saying searching the scriptures is not actually enough if you don't also come to Christ. So I do think that's a powerful line to bring up in some contexts. If somebody doesn't believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, refuses to like pray before the Blessed Sacrament, and thinks that they can just search the scriptures and find everything they need that way. It is striking that Jesus doesn't just say search the scriptures as a positive. He treats that as inadequate in some important ways. Now, I'm not, in fact, that's the only place the phrase search the scriptures appears. I just checked. I'm not accusing Protestants of all doing that, but you can find particular instances which that would be, I think, a powerful verse to point out. Resurrection Design Co. Cool. It says, hi, Joe. How do we reconcile what Unum Sanctum says about the salvation of Protestants with Vatican II? Well, Unum Sanctum doesn't speak directly to Protestants because Protestants don't exist yet. But I take the point. It is necessary for salvation that all men be subject to the Roman pontiff. And here you have, I was thinking about this recently. Theologically, we have a hard time knowing what to do with Protestantism because, as then Cardinal Ratzinger points out, they don't have real churches. They don't have apostolic succession or bishops. So from a Catholic perspective, you go all the way back to like Ignatius when he talks about what you need to have a church. They don't have those things. And I was listening to the Pillar podcast yesterday. I always advertise them. I hope they enjoy that. They need to start telling them to pony up the money. Come on. This is an endorsement deal. Just kidding. The Pillar podcast, they were talking about how even the Orthodox tend to treat Protestantism as more of like a Catholic problem, seemingly. And that's not inaccurate. Like Protestantism breaks off of Catholicism. But it also means like, think about like all of the ecumenical overtures being made right now between the ecumenical patriarch and the Pope, and how excited Catholics are and how worried a lot of Orthodox seem to be, because we kind of all know if there were a real reunion, it wouldn't be the end of Catholicism. It would be the end of Eastern Orthodoxy as a distinct thing. They would just be back as part of the Catholic Church. And maybe we don't all know that, but it seems like the way people are reacting. The Orthodox are very alarmed by reunion with the Pope. And the Catholics are like, wonderful, we want to be reunited with our, separated brethren in the East. Well, similarly, when it comes to Protestants, there's a certain sense in which these are just protesting members of the Roman Communion in the Western Church. That if, it would be bizarre for, the Lutherans to become Eastern Orthodox tomorrow. They would not be faithful to their own history. They were never Eastern Orthodox. Their forefathers were never Eastern Orthodox. Their whole theological tradition is a breakaway from Catholicism. And so if they were to be restored, it would be restored to Catholicism, not to, Eastern Orthodoxy. I don't say that as I think the Orthodox regularly point this out of like, haha, look at how fractured you guys are. Look at all these Protestants who broke away from you. That if there's reunion, it's everybody seemingly reuniting with the Catholic Church. And the way a lot of ecumenical dialogue works, it sort of is, what would the Catholic Church have to give up to get you to come back? Now, the reality is there's a limit to how much we could give up, because it's not all ours to give away. It's divine patrimony. But that's where a lot of the conversation is happening. So whatever you may think of those conversations, there's at least this real sense in which everyone has a sort of kind of funny relationship to the Pope. Even the people who don't recognize his authority often spend a lot of time, this is by no means universal, often spend a lot of time like talking about him, thinking about what the conditions would be. Like the number of times I've spoken to, let me just put it like this. I think I can defend this claim. In talking to Protestants who've become Eastern Orthodox, I don't think I've ever met one who didn't seriously consider whether they should become Eastern Orthodox or Catholic. And they often had some hang up about Catholicism, so they became Orthodox. In talking to people who've gone from Protestant to Catholic, the vast majority of them are not even aware a thing called Eastern Orthodoxy exists or felt no need to go explore it if they did know it existed. That there is just not the same spiritual claim being placed on the life of ordinary Christians by Orthodoxy or Protestantism's various forms as there is by Catholicism. That this question of, is the Pope my Pope, is something a surprising number of people have grappled with in some way, shape, or form. Circling all that back around. Unum Sanctum talks about the fact that if you aren't subject to the Roman Pontiff as you're supposed to be, that is damnable. And that's true. Now, for any kind of damnable sin to be damned, like actually damning, it needs not only to be materially grave, which this is, but also needs to be something that you're doing knowingly and intentionally. So there's a difference between erring and disobeying. Someone who just innocently errs is not guilty of a sin if they had no reason to know better. Somebody who disobeys is guilty of a sin because they know better and then they're refusing to obey. The example I always use, picking on my poor children who are 6, 4, and 2, is that my kids are Trinitarian heretics. I don't know what their theology is exactly, but if you were to grill them about the Trinity, I think you could probably stump them a little bit. That's different than a grown-up who says, I reject the Trinity. They might have the exact same beliefs. I have no idea what my kids' beliefs, if pressed, would be on this. But if they held those same beliefs as adults willfully and obstinately, that would become sinful. It is not sinful right now. Almost everybody will acknowledge that is just very obvious. This is why like a baby can go to heaven. But if that's the case, it means we all have some sense of the need for knowledge and consent for any kind of sin. Now, the other example I like to use is just with sexual sin. If you are in your just reading, actually listening to an audiobook doesn't count as reading, maybe. The 9 Tailors. No, shouldn't have said the name of the book because I'm going to spoil this. It's a good book. Sorry, I'm going to have to spoil the 9 Tailors for you, like I just said. There's a twist where a woman believes that her first husband has died and she's gotten remarried. But then it turns out her first husband has faked his death. She is not guilty of adultery. That's an important moral consideration that hopefully everyone agrees on. She is an adulteress in fact, but not morally, or not spiritually, right? This is what's called material adultery, not formal adultery. Like materially, she is involved with a man who's not her husband. Similarly, you can talk about this not just with knowledge, but with consent. So if somebody forced themselves upon you, materially, there's been a sexual contact outside of the bonds of matrimony. But of course, you're not morally guilty of that because you didn't consent to this. St. Augustine writes to the virgins of Rome after they've been attacked by the barbarians, and he affirms that they are still virgins in the sense that matters to God because they didn't consent. So those kind of scenarios. Now, let's think about the situation in Protestantism. In the 16th century, these people who were raised Catholic rejected Catholicism. In the 20th or 21st century, you've got people who live in these places where they haven't been Catholic for centuries, who have never seriously considered the claims of the Catholic Church and have never given them any more thought than you've given thought as to why are you not Baha'i? Some, again, as I said earlier, some people have given it more thought, maybe more than maybe more than we realize, but maybe have gotten such a skewed picture of the Catholic Church that it is morally right that they should say no to the claims of the kind of monster they were told was the Catholic Church. So, quick digression as I'm just going long on everything today. It's one of those. And look, whatever. Yes, Leo is at the new house. I have a funny story about that too, but it's kind of a sad story. Okay, I'm going to tell two stories. These are just digressions. So if you're wanting me to be efficient, this is not your day. We moved about 5 blocks away to our new house, and we love it. It's wonderful. But we went to get some packages that had got shipped to the wrong house. And my 2-year-old saw the old house and got really sad and goes, "Go home, go home." And we were like, "Oh, we moved. Um, we were at our new house." And then we're like, "Remember, the kitty's at our new house." And so he was sort of satisfied by that answer. Then we had to get packages again. I don't know who's doing these things. I think we've got everything updated. I'm not pointing any fingers, but I don't think it was me. Uh, Went and got packages from the new house, and he was with us again. And he got really sad again, said, "Go home." And then he said, "Kitty want go home." He tried to tell us, like, "I know the cat's at the new house, but actually the kitty really wants to go to the old house." So we were really like, it was cute, it's touching and kind of heartbreaking. All right, the other point, which is much more on point, I was just replying to the people who had cat related comments in the comments. I was on an airplane coming from Turin back to Rome, back when I lived in Rome, sitting next to a young woman who was from somewhere in Scandinavia, maybe Sweden, maybe Finland. I don't remember. And she lived now in southern Italy, which is, like a very Catholic. She went from a place that was like overwhelmingly culturally Lutheran to a place overwhelmingly culturally Catholic. And I asked her how that was going, and she said, "We look upon each other as idiots." That was her exact wording, and I thought it was hilarious. And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "They always say things to me like, 'You don't know who Padre Pio is?' But then when I told them I was Lutheran, they asked me if Martin Luther King founded my religion." So what I mean to say is, it's very easy for those of us who are doing things like watching an apologetics live stream for fun on a Monday to imagine that our brother and sister in Christ are equally theologically well versed and will be judged accordingly. And I think that is a mistake. I think many people either lack the interest or the aptitude and have been content to hear, "Oh, the Catholic Church believes all this crazy idolatrous nonsense." And in a sort of simple trust of their pastors, false pastors perhaps, but their pastors have just said, "Oh, okay, well, I'll steer clear of that," and have never given it a second thought. Now, someone who is knowingly keeping their head in the sand to not find out the truth, that is not invincible ignorance. That is vincible ignorance. And that is um, actually bad. Like you're more culpable for that. Like if you purposely don't find out if your spouse is alive so you can go get married to somebody else, you're not in the same situation as the one I described earlier. You purposely keep yourself in the dark, that it adds to your guilt, doesn't excuse it. But you can have a situation where, and I think we find this, where you have people who for centuries have grown up in these Protestant countries or cultures or subcultures, and they just don't know anything um, anything better. So they're not going to be held culpable in the same way. That the world of Unum Sanctum, the world of even the Council of Trent, they could suppose a certain level of knowledge about the Catholic Church that you just can't suppose today. I hope that makes sense. Helena Bastian says, "Saw your response to Father Moses. Saw you did a great job. Thank you. But he is still super convincing. I was convincing to Shameless Popery. More responses to Orthodox." I don't know when you sent that. I did another response to Orthodox recently. It's funny. Someone sent me yesterday that Cleave to Antiquity was like complaining that I was like picking on the Orthodox for replying to his anti-Catholic stuff. I'll have to find it. It was very funny to me. Oh gosh, who sent that to me? If I was any good at live streaming, I'd be like, obviously this is not the time to try to find that. Okay, here it is. How do I gotta log in? Come on. Every now and then you can tell I'm a 40-year-old trying to use the internet. Somebody sent me a link to Fool in the Knave's Instagram where they said not beating the little brother syndrome accusations, because Father Moses had made an entire video attacking Catholicism, and it is baseless stuff. And I replied by saying two things. Number one, When you talk about the beautiful spirituality, he rightly affirms the Orthodox having of theosis. I pointed out we also have that spirituality. We're actually in agreement on that. And number two, when he pointed out these problems that he sees the Catholic Church is having, these are also problems the Orthodox Church has. So I'm not saying like Orthodoxy is horrible. I'm saying we've got the same strengths and weaknesses on like these 5 different areas he mentioned. That was it. And Cleaver Antiquity says, I've noticed a massive uptick in Roman Catholic anti-Orthodox content over the last 2 months. Why do you think that is? What? It's anti-Orthodox to answer the allegation that like these like false claims about Catholicism are false. I mean, if you look at my channel, overwhelmingly, I respond to a lot of Protestant claims, but I do want to mix it up. I want to respond to the claims made by atheists and by Eastern Orthodox, etc. And partly to keep the channel fresh, partly to answer questions you might actually have, because at a certain point, it's like there's a lot of people who are answering the Protestant objections to Catholicism, and they're not very good objections. But as I hope the Father Moses stuff revealed, a lot of the Orthodox ones are also not very good. You've got 2 categories. You've got the people who get like way in the weeds of like this argument in the 9th century over Photis or something. That's going to be the key to decide who's right. It's like, I think you've completely missed the forest for the trees if you think that's going to be the make or break. Like if you think that God sent his Christians to go find this church that for most of history has only existed in Eastern Europe and like a teeny tiny bit outside, and he wanted everyone to be part of that. And they were supposed to know that because of like an obscure bit of theological arcana from like the 9th century or the 11th century or whatever. I find that so intensely implausible at a basic level, and find it goes so contrary to everything we see about Christ presenting the church as a city on a hill. It's visible, it's structured, it's the mustard seed that grows into the mustard tree. It's the largest of all garden plants. Like the whole point of one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church is it's easy to find. It is one, it's everywhere, it's holy, and it's got apostolic succession. We can see it traced back to the apostles. Now, you can claim apostolicity on the Orthodox side. I don't think you can claim oneness. The Pope just met with the ecumenical patriarch, and you know who didn't show up at all? The Russian Orthodox. That the titular head of Eastern Orthodoxy, the primus inter pares, the first among equals, represents this teeny tiny group of like a few thousand Christians in Turkey. And 2/3 of actual Orthodox are actually under the authority of the Russian patriarch, who is not on paper the primus inter pares, but has the actual power. And he won't even like, he regards the ecumenical patriarch as a heretic. This would be like if the largest Catholic country on earth just said, the Pope's not the Pope. And everybody just was like, but there's still one church. In what sense are they one church? Like the rift here, we can act like this is a temporary thing over like Russian politics. But at a certain point, did you say like, this is 2 different churches at least between, you've got the communion with Rome, or the communion with Russia, it's like Third Rome, and the communion with Constantinople as New Rome. And both of them are marketing their whole claim to authority off this derivative Roman authority that isn't rightly theirs. Like once upon a time, the Eastern Orthodox had a plausible case that as Rome is in tatters in the West and everything looks amazing and organized and is put together, and you got all these brilliant theologians flourishing in the East, that they're the new Rome, and this is where the heart of the church is now. Turkey today, quick fact check, Muslim country, it's not exactly the new Rome. It's not even Constantinople anymore. It's Istanbul. So the whole historic claim where someone in the past might have been convinced this is where the action is, it isn't there now. And meanwhile, like all of Eastern Orthodoxy, again, has been consolidated around like the former Iron Bloc or Iron Curtain. And I don't know. I mean, I don't find that to be this incredible, attractive alternative to Catholicism, because it doesn't seem like it's got the oneness. It certainly doesn't have the Catholicity of being around the world. It doesn't look like a mustard seed that grew into a mustard plant. It just doesn't appear to meet any of what we're told biblically. Plus, if you think about the case for Peter as head of the church And if you recognize that historically the East has acknowledged some kind of Petrine headship, even if the details of that are something we dispute, you would have to abandon that, seemingly, to just like reject the Pope and go Eastern Orthodox and just say, well, I guess the Petrine authority isn't that important after all. Or I guess it looks very different than we historically understood it to look. So no, I don't think I'm anti-Orthodox. I mean, Eastern liturgy is beautiful. There is a shared patrimony. But when you hear these Eastern arguments against Catholicism, I think they're convincing sounding to people only because we rarely respond to them because Orthodoxy is not very big. And when we do respond to them, just answering the objection is treated as an anti-Orthodox argument. Like, Father Moses isn't anti-Catholic for making a video saying the Catholic Church is false. But if I say, actually, these arguments don't work, that means I'm anti-Orthodox. That's a joke. So Ben from Cleveland Antiquity, that's a very silly thing you've said. I hope you feel a little silly about that. All right. But I am happy that you've become Eastern Orthodox instead of Protestant. I think you're on the right direction. I hope you continue that journey into the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church all the way. All right. Denise says, returning to the Catholic Church after being Protestant for 6 years, I feel less spiritually fulfilled. Is this common and why is this happening? That's a great question. I'm really sorry to hear that. I think it can happen for a few reasons. In some places, Catholic churches are very big and they can feel very lonely and anonymous. And if you came from if you think about the population, so, a lot of times when people imagine Protestant churches, they imagine like these big mega churches and stuff. But a lot of Protestant churches are very small and they might have like a couple hundred people. And they have a couple hundred people who chose to show up to that particular church because they're like really on fire and they want to be with God. Whereas you have a lot of people who are showing up to Catholic Church because they know they're supposed to, but they might be a lot weaker in their faith. They might be lukewarm. They might be going through the motions at a greater level. Those are real things. Those happen. We have evidence of a real spiritual renewal going on among young Catholics. It's true. But it's also true that there are a lot of people who aren't, who they were well formed enough to know they should continue to pray, continue to go to church. And so they try to do that, but they're not on fire. Whereas I think many Protestants are in that same place, just don't even bother going to church. And so they're not having that effect on the congregation because there's this twofold effect. So Hebrews talks about this. It is Hebrews 10. Whoops. Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. So one of the things we should be doing as Christians is stirring one another up to love and to good works. So it's actually good if you're a lukewarm Christian to come to church and to be stirred up by your neighbor. And your neighbor should take seriously that he has a duty to love you and to stir you up to love and good works. And you should consider that you have a duty to do that to your lukewarm neighbor. But the problem is if you have a lot of lukewarm neighbors who are doing that, and we're not doing a good job of stirring them up to love and good works, they can have this real bummer effect where it just feels overwhelming. They can have that kind of spiritual heaviness where there's more of them than there are of us, or it can feel that way. So I would say if you're feeling this, one thing you could do, well, I think you should look at some things like, what is your prayer life like? What is your reading scripture like? But also, what is your community like? I find that smaller churches often have a real vibrancy because you can know one another, you can get to know them a lot better, and you can connect. One thing I think Protestants do a lot better is megachurches. That if you have a megachurch, there's often like a very structured kind of mid-level tiers of people connecting to other people, and so you don't feel completely anonymous because somebody has connected with you. That's not the case everywhere, but you can find places where they've really done a good job of organizing and connecting, and you get like a gift basket or something in some cases when you connect, all this stuff to make you feel connected, integrated, part of the team, part of the community, welcome aboard. Catholic churches have struggled to do that. So finding a smaller parish could be really helpful. I noticed also that you donated with Danish krone. So I don't know what the church in Denmark is like. I know Northern Europe has historically, or in the fairly recent past as well, struggled. But if you can find faithful communities, sometimes like the fraternity or institute parishes like Latin Mass Catholics or something, find communities, Bible studies, anything where you can get a group of people in the flesh who love Jesus and care about him and are deeply committed to being Catholic. That can be incredibly helpful, because just as we need to stir one another up to love and good works, we often need to be stirred up ourselves. And if we don't have that and we're trying to go it alone, even with the aid of the sacraments, that can be a very lonely journey. So, yeah, please, guys, pray for him. Denis, I think it's Denise, but if I'm mispronouncing your name, I apologize. All right, Vin Lord says, thank you for helping my wife and I into OCIA. Well, God bless you. Speaking of people to pray for, there's two more. RP says, what's the refutation to both Peter having a wife in the New Testament and James having the final word of the council? These 2 points against papacy I can't respond to. Funny, I actually, in my episode tomorrow, which is on male headship, I very briefly mention how unpersuasive I find James having the final word of the council, and I'll explain why in a second. First, Peter may have had a wife, but the New Testament does not actually say that. There are 2 passages that get regularly mentioned, and neither of them actually proves the case. Peter had a mother-in-law, and so we know he had a wife at some point, but his wife is never mentioned, which might be just a coincidence, but it might not be. So Matthew 8 and Mark 1 both mentions Peter's mother-in-law because Jesus heals her from sickness. But it also specifies in both cases that when she's healed, she rose and served them. Now, that's a striking kind of thing, because the implication there appears to be that there's not someone currently tending house, which, if this is Peter's house, would be the role not typically of his mom, but of his wife. So it's interesting that she served them if Peter's got a wife somewhere. And a good question would be like, well, what's her name? Do we know from scripture? Do we know from tradition? There are some extra biblical traditions claiming his wife's name. What is I don't remember. Dang, I can't find it. There's a church that I think claimed what his wife's name was. But either way, there's 3 possibilities. One is that he had a wife still alive. This is not actually contrary to anything in Catholicism. Priests are allowed to be married in certain contexts. The practice of clerical celibacy is not something we're claiming is of divine origin. So the church could also say, like, we insist that all future clergy work for the church and don't have a second job somewhere else. And you could point out, well, Paul was a tent maker. And we would say, yeah, that's true. But you don't need to do that anymore. This is your job. You don't need a second job. There's no contradiction in saying this practice has changed. Like what's called the discipline changes. So we're not dealing here with a dogma. We're not saying it is impossible for a priest to be married. We're not saying it's impossible for a bishop to be married. You can find married priests right now in the Catholic Church. You can find married bishops. They're very rare, but you can find some in the history of the church. So those things are not impossible. It's not impossible for a pope to be married or to have been married. Nevertheless, I don't think Peter was married at the time he's following Christ. So he's either married still, or he's widowed, or he has put away his wife to follow a rabbi, because we have ancient practice of men doing this. I'm inclined to think he was a widow. And the reason I think he's a widow partly is that no one is tending house when his mom's sick, apparently. A lot of it is that the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. That if you think about Peter and the apostles, they are traveling around this itinerant lifestyle, and they're gone for very long periods of time. Peter himself has pretty well established travels away from Jerusalem to Antioch and to Rome, where he's martyred. That would be somewhat unusual for a married man. No idea why it keeps crashing, but I fixed the audio this time. It didn't trick me. It tried to default to having my camera be the audio again. Anyway, it'd be very unusual for someone following Jesus in this way and then going off on his own to, Antioch and to Rome, building up churches there and being martyred. It'd be strange to leave his family behind. We don't have any record of his family traveling with him as he's, journeying with Jesus, and the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, etc. The other text that you have to grapple with is just badly translated. Let me find it here. 1 Corinthians 9. There is a line that is taken out of context and badly translated. 1 Corinthians 9 says, "Do we not have the right to be accompanied by," and this translation, many others say, "by a wife, as the other apostles and the brethren of our Lord and Cephas?" So it's like, aha, there it is. When Peter traveled, he was traveling with his wife. The difficulty here is that the Greek there literally says woman or sister. Now, that can mean wife in some contexts, but it doesn't here. Instead, it refers to women who are financially supporting the apostles. So if you go back to Luke 8, in Luke 8, it says, "Soon afterwards he," Jesus, "went on through cities and villages, preaching and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God, and the 12 were with him, and also some women who'd been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their means." 2 things to note here. Number 1, there are women accompanying Jesus and the apostles, but these women are clearly women who are financially supporting the apostles. Their task isn't to preach, but they are financing. They're major stewards. 2, that is itself, it seems to me, a pretty clear thing that it's pretty weird that no wives are mentioned. Jesus's wife isn't mentioned. The apostles' wives aren't mentioned. If Jesus or the apostles are married, why don't we hear of it? Now, most Protestants reading that would say, well, clearly the lack of a wife mentioned for Jesus means he wasn't married. And I would say equally clearly, the fact that 12 are mentioned with no wives and they're traveling with other women. If I just told my wife, I'm going to go on maybe a couple year long journey with some other lady as we follow this rabbi, I don't think that conversation is going to go well. Maybe wrong. I may be misjudging my wife here. But man, I don't think that's going to go well. So all that's to say, the women who accompanied Jesus and the apostles were not their wives. These were financial supporters. And when you have that biblical context right there in Luke 8, it's so clear from 1 Corinthians 9 that that is the proper understanding. Because literally the whole point that Paul is making here is that he is allowed to charge and doesn't. He says, this is 1 Corinthians 9, verse 3. "This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to our food and drink? Do we not have the right to be accompanied by," and it actually says by a woman, "as the other apostles and the brethren of our Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living?" Now that makes no sense if he's saying, I should be able to be married so I don't have to work. I mean, look, I would love that. My wife would not love it if my understanding of marriage was I no longer have to work for a living. "Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Who tends a flock without getting some of the milk?" All of that is him saying in different ways, I could financially benefit from proclaiming the gospel, but I do it for free so that I'm not a burden to you. That's exactly what he's talking about here. And one of the ways the other apostles are remunerated for their preaching of the gospel is that they have wealthy women who travel with them and support them out of their own finances. Paul doesn't, but he could, or he could charge you, and he's not going to. That's his point. And so it's crazy. It drives me. It's one of the most aggravating mistranslations because it's like, are you even reading what is being said here? Wife doesn't make any sense. And the word there is woman, not wife. And you have this other biblical context where it obviously is referring to women financially supporting the apostles and Jesus. And that's what he's talking about in context. Okay. So then the other half of the question is, what about Acts 15? So in long story short, Priestly celibacy is not something we claim of divine origin. There is a long-standing practice going back, I would say, to the time of the apostles. But a widower becoming a priest, even a married man becoming a priest, is not impossible. Our last chaplain at Catholic Answers was a married priest who had been an Anglican priest who became Catholic. So that's no debunking of Catholicism. The other one is Acts 15, Council of Jerusalem. And I would just say this, Luke 22, the model of a leader is not to lord your authority over those that you're serving, but is rather to serve them. Jesus is among us as one who serves, and the model for that is him washing the feet of the apostles. So one of the things that I think we should take away is, if you have an ecumenical council, does that disprove the papacy? No, it shouldn't. Because if the Pope is a true leader, he should be listening and serving the people that he's leading. That the point of the papacy isn't one guy calls all the shots without listening to anybody else. And that's, I mean, even something like, people say, oh, what about the Vatican I model of the papacy? Vatican I is a council. Like, clearly, Vatican I is not saying ecumenical councils are irrelevant. It is an ecumenical council. So the caricature of the papacy that I hear from Orthodox and Protestant sources that treats the Vatican I model of the papacy as anti-conciliar is incoherent, since Vatican I is a council. That clearly, if your understanding of the papacy is this means councils don't matter or are redundant, where here's a council explaining the limits and contours of papal authority, then you've misunderstood the papacy in a pretty profound way. With that said, in Acts 15, what's going on? Well, the whole question is whether uncircumcised men can be saved. Peter has already unilaterally acted at God's prompting in Acts 10 by opening the door of salvation to the Gentiles in the form of Cornelius and his family. And then in Acts 11, he has defended this to the church in Jerusalem. But so he has done it individually. If you're wanting the Pope to act in a unilateral way to be Pope, Peter already did that. He does it in Acts 10, he does it in Acts 11. The controversy doesn't die down, and so there's an ecumenical council. And James plays a really, it's not an ecumenical council. It's a local council in Jerusalem. It's not part of the whole church. So James is the bishop of Jerusalem at this point. Now you can actually see this. So when you go back to Easter, I'm trying to remember which gospel it's in. Hang on, give me just a second. Tell Peter and the others. Mark 16. So in Mark 16, Peter's authority is signaled in a clear way. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you to Galilee. There you will see him as he has told you. So Peter is singled out. In Acts 2, we're told Peter stands with the 11. The 12 are described as Peter and the 11. Very clear. But then Peter eventually leaves Jerusalem after his arrest and miraculous release. This is Acts 12, I believe. And so he is miraculously saved and he's released, but he realizes that it is inopportune for him to remain in Jerusalem. And so he says, go tell my wife I'm leaving. No, I'm just kidding. He doesn't. He says, tell this to James and to the brethren. So he's signaling with that phrasing, James and the brethren, who he is handpicking as his own successor. So the next bishop of Jerusalem is James. And he's handpicked by Peter. James has no prominence in the church in Jerusalem before that. And then after that has this very clear authority. And so that authority you see in the Council of Jerusalem, as the leaders in Jerusalem are present, Peter is now back with them. There's a big debate. Peter speaks and the crowd falls silent. That gives Paul and Barnabas the chance to testify to what God has done. And then James stands up, reaffirms what Simon has said, and then says that he agrees with it and says, therefore, my judgment is we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is perfectly consistent with Peter having a papal authority and the bishop that he entrusted saying, I think he's right. on a disciplinary issue that he's already acted unilaterally on, by the way. Let me put it this way. Imagine for a second the shoe was on the other foot. Imagine that it wasn't Peter, that James went out, said, by God's prompting, I've been told to open the doors to the Gentiles, and then he defended that action. Every Orthodox, every Protestant under the sun would point to that and say, this clearly disproves the papacy. Look at how James is acting without the authority of Peter. And then if they had a big council after that, and Peter just said, like, yeah, I think James is right, they would say, obviously, look at how big James is. Peter's just reaffirming what he's already said and done on his own. He didn't have to wait for Peter. Peter's just saying he's right. All that's to say, like, just imagine it in that direction for a second. I think you'd see that the exact same argument would be used if Peter and James's roles were reversed to say the other way around. So I think Peter's acting very papally here. And I think anyone who's ever seen the Pope in real life knows that he doesn't just steamroll all the bishops and ignore everything they have to say. He tries to do things collaboratively. And when popes don't do that well, the bishops are often not shy about calling them out for that. Okay. I'm going to answer maybe 3 more questions. Oh, no, I'll answer 4 more questions because I'm 4 questions away from the current stream. Everything we've covered for the last 2 hours has just been prior questions I had. This way, I'll at least be caught up to today. And then 2 weeks from now, I'll do all these questions and then all the whatever. I'm not going to promise anything I can't commit to. Never mind. Ignore that. Junior Burger says, went to church for the first time ever. God bless you. Expecting instant change. How foolish, right? During my faith journey, will it ever become easier to resist temptation? Sorry if this is a silly question. That is not a silly question at all. You are doing a wonderful thing, and it is very hard to do a hard thing at first. Whether it's eating healthy, whether it's working out, whether it's studying, whether it's anything under the sun, doing the right thing is usually very hard at first. Sometimes you'll have like a fun early enthusiasm where everything feels really good, and then the hard part comes like a few weeks in, but frequently it's hard right away. But that's not a bad sign. You've, I think, correctly discerned the call of God and are responding to it, and you're just finding that often it's hard to do the right thing. One of the basic things that we believe as Christians is doing the wrong thing in a broken world is often easier than doing the right thing, but doing the right thing is more fulfilling. And again, you can see this in any number of ways. It is easier to lie than to tell the truth often. It's easier to fall into sexual sin than to live in sexual integrity. It's easier to eat junk food than to eat right. It's easier to lay on the couch than to go exercise. It's easier to get drunk than to be moderate. Whatever it is, it's easier to be proud than to be humble, right? Whatever it is. The sinful thing is usually easier than the right thing. But you've probably lived long enough to know that the easy thing is less fulfilling, that you come away from doing the easy sinful thing and you feel worse about yourself, and rightly so, because you haven't lived the kind of life you were called to live. You were made to do hard things, and you were made to do great things. And so settling for anything less than that is a betrayal, not only of God, but of yourself, that you've just betrayed who you were called to be. In a small way, in a big way, whatever it is. And so God wants something better for you, something more for you. And that's the exciting thing. So let me tell you this 4-fold schema that I have found very helpful. This is coming from St. Thomas Aquinas and from others, but there's 4 levels in the spiritual life. Now, or in the life of virtue. There's other ways you can categorize things, but I find this very helpful. The bottom level is called viciousness. This is from the word vice. This is where the word vicious comes from. In vice, you do the sinful thing and you delight in it. You know, you've got people who are really like, they're living sexual sin and they think it's really like exciting and fun. That's as low as it gets on any kind of sin. A tier above that is called incontinence. Incontinence means like you actually aren't content to live the life of sin, but you're often ending up there. So this might be where you sin and feel gross. And in fact, the way you described it, like, does it ever get easier to resist temptation? Sounds like you might be at that tier right now. And if so, I've got good news for you. It does, but you have some more hardship to go through. Because above incontinence is continence. And many people mistake this for virtue, but it's not. Continence is doing the right thing, but it is difficult. So you really want to fall into that sin and you kind of white knuckle it and you resist and you get through it and you don't fall. But it's not easy. It's something that's taking a lot of work. But again, think about learning a language. I'm mentioning just things I'm bad at. Learning a language, dieting, exercising, um, studying anything. And you've got the really hard work, but then there can be that time where it gets easier. That's what virtue is. Virtue is not just doing the right thing. Virtue is doing the right thing habitually. So, like this, I will sometimes ask my kids whether they did something wrong, and they will pause and they will weigh their options as to how likely they think it is they can get away with a lie. And then they'll tell me the truth sometimes. That is continence. They are struggling and they're coming out on the right end of the struggle, or they'll struggle and they'll come out on the wrong end, and that's incontinence. They're not just like knee jerk, smoothly lying. They're not getting away with it either. There's a struggle. But hopefully, as they continue to engage in that practice, telling the truth will become more and more and more second nature. So somebody who you saw who like always almost lied to you, you would not say that person has the virtue of honesty. You would say that person has a problem with honesty. Even if they're being honest, it's a struggle for them. But a person who is just so knee-jerk honest that it's not even a struggle anymore, that's the virtue. Every part of the Christian life, we're called to strive for that virtue. You might be more in the virtuous territory in one area than another. Some areas might be more of a struggle. That's normal. But it does get easier. It doesn't always get easy, but it does get easier. I don't know the particulars of your struggle, but I can tell you that. I can also tell you, particularly, I don't know how junior you are, Junior Burger, but a lot of times the sins of young men are inflamed by things like hormones. And some of that becomes bodily somewhat easier as you get older. Those battles become a little easier to win as you mature, as you build up both the interior self-discipline, but also as your body chills out a little bit. And, maybe you get married and you have healthier ways of expressing everything your body wants to express. All right. But I don't know. I hope that helps. Papa Sans says, I've asked others, but I haven't gotten a solid answer. Genuinely curious, not trying to prove a worldview. In Against Heresies, Book 3, Irenaeus refers to Rome as of Paul and Peter. How do we go from that to the Pope? Yeah, that the Pope is got the Apostolic See. So named not just for the Apostle Peter, but also for Paul. So the Pope is the successor of Peter. Paul is very clear in Romans that he is not founding himself the Church of Rome, but there is a sense in which the two co-founders of the Church of Rome are Peter and Paul. There's a beautiful parallel to that in Remus and Romulus and the building up of the city of Rome, where you have the twins. And so on the church's calendar, the feast day of Peter and Paul is a shared feast that, we very much honor this dual legacy they have. So even though in terms of succession, it's upon Peter's death that the authority of office passes on, the spiritual foundation of the Church of Rome isn't just Petrine, it's Petrine and Pauline. So I would say that's how we go from that. And you see that, because you see, like, I guess, like this. The blessed apostles, then, this is Irenaeus, Book 3, as you referenced, having founded and built up the church, committed it into the hands of Linus, the office of the episcopate. So you'll notice from Peter and Paul onwards, Linus, Cletus, Clement, Sixtus, so on, you always see one man holding the episcopate. So there's two ways of reading that. One is to say that Irenaeus thought that the episcopate started like right after, like the apostles set it up, but they didn't practice it. And the other is to say, no, even though they're founding and organizing the church together, one of them is holding that episcopal authority, but it's never held by two people equally at the same time. And I think you can read Ignatius or Irenaeus, and clearly come away with an idea of a monoepiscopacy. Boom, boom, boom. Nick Corrado says, "Hey Joe, here's a question. Suppose a new archaeological discovery is made tomorrow pertaining to the Bible. What would you most like to see?" Whew. Is it cheating to do like a documentary? I mean, I'm imagining from this question that you're thinking of like a church or a tomb or something like this. There are some fragments of Irenaeus that we don't have the full works, but the fragments we have are really fascinating. I think that'd be really cool to have. Um, Also, more early house churches. A lot of liturgical disputes. If we saw the particular ways the house churches are laid out and the role of the altar and everything else, I think that could be really helpful in getting a greater clarity about how the Christians worshipped. More catacomb inscriptions with super Catholic things would be cool. More ancient Marian prayers. So there is like one of the controversies, the sub tuum presidium is this ancient prayer, and it's on what is that? Ryland's Papyrus 490 or 470, excuse me. It's been dated anywhere from the 3rd to the 9th century. The early dating uh, was like suggested that this prayer, that the physical version of the prayer we had is from like the 200s or 300s. Later scholars have questioned that and said maybe it was later. A lot of the arguments are about really detailed things about like the way the script looks. If that early dating is correct, it's super fascinating because when you think about prayers, usually you don't write down the prayers that you pray. So if someone found a copy of one of the prayers, and particularly a rote prayer, there's a good chance that's not something that you just came up with. It was something that you've been praying for a long time and that maybe everybody's been praying for a long time, well before anybody wrote it down. And not just wrote it down, but wrote it down on a piece of papyrus that it happened to be recovered. And so a lot of things have to go right. We've lost 90 some odd percent of the papyrus that have been written. I don't know how they come up with that number, but like anywhere outside of very dry climates like Egypt, papyrus is going to disintegrate. It just isn't going to hold up well enough. So the fact that we have a prayer that may be as old as the 200s in the written copy suggests that it would be even older than that in terms of people praying it. Because again, it's unlikely we happen to physically have a copy of the oldest version of it, and we know this was a common early Christian prayer to Mary. So something like that would be really cool. I don't know what that would look like without seeing it, but those would be some. Yeah, it's a fun question. Okay. Harold, so randomized lavender tea says, what's your opinion on the heralds of the gospel? I have to be honest that I am not familiar with them at all. Oh, okay. It looks like they were connected with TFP, Tradition, Family, and Property. I am familiar with them. When I went to look up Heralds of the Gospel, and the reason I laughed is because autocomplete thought I was looking up Heralds of Galactus, which would be, I would not like that as a religious order in the church. So it looks like they're Portuguese. Looks like they've been controversial because of their connection with TFP. I don't know if they've been. Okay, it looks like the Vatican investigated them in 2017. Man, I don't know. I don't know anything about them, and I don't want to just opine in a completely ignorant way. So I apologize for not being more helpful. I don't know how active they are in the US. Let me look. Okay, it looks like they have some communities. They've got a community in Florida and a community in Texas. That's it. It looks like they're much more in Latin America, which makes sense why Florida and Texas. But yeah, I've not crossed paths with them, so I don't want to just guess based on association or anything like that. It would not be fair. Alexander Blue says Redeem Zimmer made a comment that I heard before that one of the differences / frictions of East versus West apostolic Christianity comes from Latin being a legal language and legal thinking versus Greek being a philosophy language. I mean, I don't particularly buy that. I've heard things like that, but Byzantine as an adjective, to mean excessively complicated and intricate, refers to like their legal structure. And a lot of the issues that we've seen in even the fairly recent past in Eastern Orthodoxy, think about like the allowing multiple marriages, those were concessions to Eastern Roman law. So this idea of like they're all these like mystic philosophers and we're all these like civil lawyers or canon lawyers, I think those are stereotypes in both directions that are not well founded. I get where they're coming from. They can have some accuracy with it, but I think there is this tendency to glamorize the even recent Eastern past in this way that owes largely to some 19th century movements within Orthodoxy. So without, again, like, I really do. I love Eastern Orthodox. I think there's a lot of beautiful, rich Eastern Orthodox spirituality. I like to acknowledge all the places where we have this common ground. But when people ask this, I do want to acknowledge some of the areas where I'm not as convinced. And I think I maybe did this in my recent episode as well. But I think one of the things happening is after the 11th century, after you got the Great Schism, some put it at 1054, but it's a little more complicated than that. The Eastern Orthodox are incapable of having an ecumenical council because they need the Pope to have a valid council. They are torn as to whether that's true or not, because a lot of Orthodox today believe in a theory called receptionism, that for something to be a council, you need it to be received by all of the patriarchs. Now, that doesn't make sense for a lot of reasons. Number one, Chalcedon doesn't meet that definition, is considered an ecumenical council. Number two, the whole idea of receptionism then hinges so heavily on how much and how long does it have to be received, because like the Council of Florence is received by the ecumenical patriarch. So what are the, I mean, I guess you could say the other patriarchs didn't receive this, and maybe that's not a very good argument, but you can find cases where the ecumenical patriarch and the Roman emperor received things like the filioque and the papacy as true. Oh, ABZ 163. You asked me to explain Treasury of Merit. I actually did that earlier in this stream. This is part 2. I don't remember if it's in part 1 or part 2. If you want me to explain it again, I can, but let me know because I explained it today. Okay, sorry. That seemed easier than explaining Treasury of Merit again. So anyway, all that's to say, after the Great Schism, there are no more Eastern Orthodox ecumenical councils, and there should be, because there are new heresies that arise. You even have like an ecumenical patriarch who's a Calvinist. You have all this stuff. It's a mess. The West continues to have ecumenical councils because we don't need the approval of the Patriarch of Constantinople to have an ecumenical council. We didn't in Nicaea when he didn't really exist. We don't now. Any more than we needed, the Patriarch of Alexandria to approve Chalcedon, which he didn't. The Pope's authority is the one needed to confirm an ecumenical council and its validity, and we have that. So we've continued to have ecumenical councils, and sometimes you will find Orthodox treat this as a point of pride, like, oh, we don't have to define everything. It's like, well, you can't define everything. You can't have councils. But pretending like this is it's kind of like if you can't get a job and then you market yourself as like how carefree and not with the system you are, to try to convince people like, oh, you should be like me, I'm a rebel. It's like, well, you can't get a job. Well, likewise, if you can't hold a council, I'm not that impressed by your status. I'm not convinced. I'm back. Sorry. If you don't have a council. I'm not convinced, like, can't have a council. I'm not convinced by how like mystical you are by letting things remain undefined. In the early church, the Greeks were fantastic. I mean, Greeks here in the Greek speaking sense, not like people of Greece. The Greek theologians were fantastic at these very nuanced, subtle distinctions. And every bit as competent as any of the Latin fathers. On a lot of the Trinitarian stuff, they absolutely led the charge. They were dealing with different heresies in the East and in the West. That's an important part of the story. But I think that there's kind of a treating them as just like mystic philosophers later when they were actually doing nuanced, subtle theology. And yeah, that's what I'd say to that. Okay. I was going to stop here, but this is one of my favorite questions to answer. So I'm just going to do this one last one. It's also from an average Joseph, 2029. He said, if Mary was a sworn virgin, in what way was her marriage to Joseph valid? There was no reason for Joseph to expect children out of the relationship. And I thought that was the whole point of marriage. So that is one of the points of marriage, but that is not the whole point of marriage. And marriage looks substantially different in Judaism than in Christianity. So the ends of marriage are threefold. But let me find. Boom, 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 boom. So the primary end of marriage is the procreation and education of marriage. Nope, let me try that again. The primary end of marriage is the procreation and education of children, but there are also secondary ends, such as mutual aid, the cultivating of mutual love, and the quieting of concupiscence, which husband and wife are not forbidden to consider so long as they're subordinated to the primary end and so long as the intrinsic nature of the act is preserved. That's talking about the marital act. This is from Casti Canubi. There's also a sort of third dimension of marriage when we're talking about the sacramental theology of the imaging of Christ in the church of Christian marriage. So you have fidelity, permanence, fecundity, all of that kind of baked into marriage. In the case of the marriage of Joseph and Mary, something else complicates the picture as well, which is all of what we've just said is ordered towards a Christian understanding of marriage that in some ways exists and in some ways doesn't exist at the time of Jesus's birth. Obviously, the dimension of it imaging Christ in the church doesn't exist, but also different is how a marriage is consummated. And I've done episodes on this about Mary as an unwed mother and all this, that the consummation of a marriage in Judaism is the Nisuin, the coming together of the husband and wife under one roof. That the sexual act was not what created the union. So you could, or at least not what consummated the union. The sexual act could create the union in the first stage, because Jewish weddings are in two stages, the Kiddushin and the Nisuin. The Kiddushin could be established through sexual act, through dowry, or through an exchange of promises. This is in the Jewish Talmud. This is chapter 1, verse 1 of the tract on the Kiddushin. That then began a process that was anywhere from a few months to a year, depending on whether the woman's father was alive, in which the new husband would go and prepare a home for his wife. You see this reflected very beautifully in John chapter 14, when Jesus says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe in also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And when I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. Now, what we miss in hearing that is that those were the kind of words that a husband could say to his wife. Now that you and I are married, now that we've had the Kiddushin, my job is now to go and prepare a place for you, that where I am, you may be also. That is why we can talk about the church as the bride of Christ right now, even though we don't live with Christ in the way we will hereafter. That eventually we will be with Christ permanently and perfectly. That's the second stage of our union. But there is a real stage in which we can talk about being betrothed, but that sounds like we're just engaged. We're actually married, but not living together. Similarly, St. Paul talks about the church in this way as well. So he says, I feel a divine jealousy for you, for I betrothed you to Christ to present you as a pure bride to her one husband. So notice in the Greek here is trying to express this complicated Jewish reality that the church is already bride to Christ, but also isn't living with him because you have the two stages to the marriage. So in the case of Joseph and Mary, you could have a valid marriage that was consummated without it being consummated sexually, that it was consummated rather by coming to live together. You can't have that now with Christian marriage because Christian marriage is consummated by the sexual act. So that's why you have things called Josephite marriages, but it's a little bit misleading because the way marriage worked is just different now than in the first century. All right. I hope that helped. Thanks for everybody who stuck around. And I will get more to the questions, beginning with Awesome Sam's question about the mode of presence in the Eucharist and a Baptist mother-in-law who claims the right to receive communion at any church as a Christian. Oh boy. All of those and more beginning 2 weeks from now. All right. God bless you guys. Peace.